So on this episode, I want to highlight thoughts on non-compliance and resistance from two very important writers about a century apart. John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, writing around the time of the Stamp Act, and then also Lysander Spooner in the times of the absolutely horrible and evil Federal Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850, and plus a few others to add a little to it. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is everything you need to follow us. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. And there you're going to find all the archives of the show, all the platforms we're on. We're on a bunch of video platforms, and then we have the audio-only podcast edition at places like Apple and Spotify and Podbean and the rest. We're actually getting way more people checking us out on the podcast in the last few months than I had ever expected. So thank you so much for those of you following us there or anywhere. And of course, you can find on individual episodes, I post a blog for each one of those, generally an hour or two after the live broadcast is done. And there you'll find links to stuff that I'm talking about in the episode so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. And just a quick scheduling note, because I've got a hike scheduled with family this morning, I am not going to spend any extra time on the live chat during the show, but I will check it out probably a little bit later today or tomorrow. And it's very likely that instead of doing my normal Wednesday morning broadcast, I might push it back to Thursday morning. So if you're looking for a live show and you don't see the notification, it's probably that I'm a day behind schedule, but I will definitely do the normal number of shows. I just may switch around the schedule a little bit this week. But anyways, let's get right to this. And this is something that I've been talking about quite a bit in recent months, the idea of non-compliance and resistance. And I've been regularly highlighting at least one quote by John Dickinson from this broadside against the Stamp Act. It was published in November of 1765, and it's got an essential principle for any government act that you think shouldn't exist in the first place that we should pay attention to today. And it's a little small on the screen. I got to find a better version of this particular document. Maybe we'll publish it over on our site. It's actually been a goal of mine for a long time to actually have a section on our own website at 10thamendmentcenter.com with all the historical documents that we reference and just keep adding to it. I just haven't gotten to that yet. One of these days. Anyways, here's Dickinson talking about what to do with the Stamp Act just as it's about to go into effect in November. I think it was November of 1765. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. Merely by complying with it, you're actually riveting those chains. Why? He says, you unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So if they're claiming an authority that they shouldn't have had in the first place, and again, we can talk about this in regards to the Stamp Act or any today federal act that shouldn't be done that isn't authorized by the Constitution, or even I guess we could start thinking about state acts that aren't authorized by state constitutions as well. You're actually giving them, you're empowering them through your compliance. And that's how Dickinson put it in that broadside against the Stamp Act. There's a lot more to it, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. But I want to jump fast forward to 1850 and Lysander Spooner's, one of my favorite documents he ever wrote. It's called A Defense for Fugitive Slaves Against the Acts of Congress, sometime in February 1793. That's the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and then of September 1850. And here's how Spooner put it, talking about how you aren't even obliged to comply with these people. I mean, you shouldn't even have this as a thought. He said to say that an unconstitutional must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one. For the latter is binding only until it's repealed. This is just common sense. If we're thinking about government or a constitution as an act of the people, as Thomas Paine once put it, and that the law is the supreme law of the land, and The idea that James Otis Jr. talked about in his arguments against the writs of assistance in 1761, which really was the kickoff of the revolution in thought that led to the War for Independence some years later. He said an act against the Constitution is void. So government doesn't have final authority, final say, sovereignty. It's the people of the several states today under the Constitution. At the time, it was the people. Power flows from the people, not the other way around. Now, if government is sovereign, if government has final say, then if they say that they're within the Constitution, even if you think they are not, then they are. They're the sovereign. But if the people have the final say and the people say, well, you shouldn't be doing this, and enough of them resist and refuse to comply, that's what keeps them in check. That's the argument that Spooner made. And of course, I covered that in more detail on another episode. I think I've got a link for it later in the show. Anyways, so Spooner is saying the idea that you even have to comply with something until they tell you you don't is saying that an unconstitutional act is equivalent to that of a constitutional one. And that is absurd. He said there would therefore be no difference at all between a constitutional and an unconstitutional law in respect to their binding force. And that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving the government unlimited power. And in some situations, maybe it's unlimited power for a month or 6 months or 5 years. But if they're not authorized to do something, they're not authorized to do something for 1 second. So the notion that you have to wait for the government that implemented the act that violates your right to stop implementing that act or to say that we no longer want it is absurd. It's the antithesis of the entire system. And that's how Dickinson actually was putting the same type of thoughts to paper in this broadside against the Stamp Act. He said the Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. And I love how he used all caps. We don't just, all caps didn't start with email forwards or fax blasts some years ago, but John Dickinson himself was using this in response to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is to be regarded only as, and he put in caps, an experiment of your disposition. They're testing you. Government wants to see, and they still do this today, they want to see how much they can get away with. And the more that you comply with what they tell you to do, no matter what it is, because you're afraid, whatever it may be. John Adams, we know, in 1776, when he was one of the good guys, said, fear is the foundation of most governments. Just remove the word most. And that's how they get their power. So as long as you're afraid of what they're going to do and you comply, you're never going to comply your way out of the mess that you're in. And it's an experiment of your disposition. He said, if you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, maybe we talk about something else bending over. But anyways, quietly bend your necks to that yoke. You prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. And of course, he used lords and masters in italics to highlight that. I think he was really pushing people to say, you have no lord. You have no lord but your creator or your master. And of course, that was a thought of the time generally, and for many people today as well. So the idea that these people can tell you, these people in a far-off land can tell you what to do, whatever they want you to do, to pay whatever they want you to pay, is total bondage, according to John Dickinson. Back to Spooner. Now, a lot of people want to tell us to say, okay, well, this one isn't terrible. We should at least, the right thing to do is to comply, and then we're going to demand that they repeal it, or we're going to sue in court. And a lot of people take this approach today. Of course, this was something that Dickinson argued against in his time, and it's also something that Spooner argued against the hated Federal Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850. He said, it is no answer to this argument to say that if an unconstitutional act be passed, the mischief may be remedied by a repeal of it. And this remedy may be brought about by discussion and the exercise of the right of suffrage. So you're just going to, demand that they get rid of the law, and then you're going to vote bums out. Maybe you'll have a lawsuit, whatever it may be. But basically, it's taking that view that you still have to comply with an unconstitutional act. It's still giving an unconstitutional act, an exercise of power never delegated to the government, the same binding force as everything else. And this is just nonsense. He says, because this is no answer. He said, because if an unconstitutional act be binding until invalidated by repeal or being overturned by a court or whatever we can call repeal, he said the government may, in the meantime, disarm the people, suppress the freedom of speech and the press, prohibit the use of the suffrage, and thus put it beyond the power of the people people to reform the government through the exercise of those rights. So it's nonsense to say, oh, let's just wait for them to repeal what they put on us in the first place. And it's not just Spooner, the radical 19th century anarchist, who is saying that. John Dickinson, penman of the Revolution, the moderate, who actually wanted to hold back on declaring independence. He wasn't against independence, but he wanted to hold back because he didn't think that they were ready. He was very much wanting to play out the process. Dickinson was not a radical in comparison to people like Adams or Paine and Samuel Adams and others. He was very middle ground. But yet he recognized that it is foolish to wait for repeal, to comply first and then wait for repeal. He's far more radical than most people are today. He said, some persons perhaps may fondly hope, and this is back to his broadside against the Stamp Act, November 1765, some persons perhaps may fondly hope it will be as easy to obtain a repeal of the Stamp Act after it is put in execution as if the execution of it is avoided. So he knows that some people at that time as well thought we're going to have the same amount of difficulty or just as much ease in getting it repealed, whether we comply with it and let it get enforced, or if we don't. And he says, but do not be deceived. This was, and he cited someone saying that this was intended as a way to establish additional power over the colonies. He says, can we imagine then that when so great a point is carried and we have tamely submitted, he said that in italics, we have tamely submitted, will they then get rid of the act that they put in the first place? He said, no. Power is of a tenacious nature. What it seizes, it will retain. Power is of a tenacious nature. This is John Dickinson's version of a phrase that I use over and over on this show. And it's power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Samuel Adams, and this is, hopefully it's a pun, power is intoxicating. And he said, men legally vested with it will always find ways to expand it. Abigail Adams, power is ever grasping. John Adams, the jaws of power are always open to devour. We have so many versions of this. George Mason said, I fear the thirst of power will oppress the people in the long run. I'm paraphrasing all these off the top of my head, but you get the concept. Power will always grow. And that's what Dickinson is pointing out here. If they're exercising a power that they shouldn't exercise in the first place, and everyone just complies with it, it's not going to be repealed. What they're going to do is they're going to expand on that, and that's going to establish what he called right off the bat the detestable precedent. We can go back to here. You voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. Again, it's about the precedent. But he also talks about tamely submitting. And this is something that we heard from many of the founders and old revolutionaries, the notion of just passive compliance and non-resistance. And here's James Otis Jr. writing as freeborn American in an essay in April of 1767, and he said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more. This is the greatest threat to liberty, according to James Otis Jr. There is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. Again, that phrase, tamely submitting. And here's Samuel Adams, father of the American Revolution, writing in his great essay as Candidus in the Boston Gazette, October 1771. And he's paraphrasing someone in this, and I've never actually touched on this. I highlight this one all the time. But it'll be cool to actually connect the dots here in just a moment. But here's Samuel Adams saying, let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. Compliance is violence. The idea that you actually comply with something that they shouldn't do because you just want to go along till you get along, whatever it may be, you're encouraging it and you're setting the precedent for many others to have the same doom. And he actually went a little further, talked about the millions of unborn who are going to pay the price for your, suffering tamely a lawless attack upon your liberty. Now, Samuel Adams was reiterating something that was widely understood. This is Thomas Gordon writing in the very famous, at least at the time, Cato's letters, letter number 42 from August 1722. 21. And this had a lot of the foundational principles, these series of letters that we find in the founders' writings. Thomas Gordon was very influential. He said, the law of nature does not only allow us, but it obliges us to defend ourselves. If you have our natural rights and the laws of nature tell us we have a right of self-preservation. That means we not only have to preserve our life, our liberty, our property, but, so if you don't do anything, you're not actually, you're not following. He said, if we, and this is the part that's going to sound familiar, I don't want to get too deeply into Cato's letters, but at some point I should probably cover these. He said, if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our property and fortunes, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. He was focusing mostly on the idea that you can't be free, and this was something that Dickinson, Adams, Otis, and so many others from the old revolutionaries would talk about. You can't be free if they can take your property without your consent. So he said, if we suffer tamely a lawless attack to take our property, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. Samuel Adams expanded that, not just to property, but to all liberty. If we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it. And Thomas Gordon goes on in Cato's letter number 42. Of course, I will link to that in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. He continues, he says, and Cicero, going back to the classics, Cicero says, quote, he who does not resist mischief when he may is guilty of the same crime as if he had deserted his parents, his friends, and his country. And here's one from Benjamin Franklin talking about tamely submitting in a letter to James Bowdoin. I think that's how you say the name. February of 1775. This is a very famous name in Massachusetts. I should know this. I know I've looked it up in the past. Anyways, February 1775, Benjamin Franklin. He said, if we tamely give up our rights in this contest, a century to come will not restore us in the opinion of the world. If you may lose, you may try to stand up for your rights and fail. That's one thing. But if you just turn yourself over like the Romans did to Caesar and you voluntarily choose the oppression, you're shameful to all history. He said, we shall be stamped with the character of dastards, poltroons, and fools. I don't know what a poltroon is, but it sounds bad. And when Franklin's using it, you know it's bad. And fools. And be despised and trampled upon, not by this haughty, insolent nation only, but by all mankind. So don't tamely give up your rights, is what Benjamin Franklin had to say. Now, Thomas Jefferson actually put the same kind of principle together years later in his response in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts of that year. And he's talking about the people of each state. He said the several states, again, this idea of tamely submitting is absurd. And the idea of having states and reserve powers under the Constitution and then allowing the central or general government to do whatever it wants is the same type of a concept. And Jefferson rails on that. The first sentence of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, he said, the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. Now, I covered this whole idea of tamely submitting and all the non-compliance and resistance in an episode a little while back. Let's see if I can pull it up here. What's the deal with all the obedience? And that was September of this last year in 2021. The doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance. This was a phrase that we saw used regularly in the time of the Revolution, 1760s, 1770s, and the like. And the founders and the old revolutionaries looked at it as incredibly destructive to liberty. James Otis, for example, said it's the greatest threat to liberty, this notion that it's better to tamely submit than to stand up for your liberty. This is a really good episode. I encourage you to check out. I will link to it in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And again, the title of this episode is Compliance is Violence. It's kind of a play off of a phrase that's more commonly used in other quarters. Now, just because compliance, though, and the notion is that when you comply, just like Dickinson, just like Spooner and so many others said, you're basically encouraging the precedent, and they're not going to back down on something that they can enforce. What they're going to do is expand on that because power always expands. Now, just because compliance is violence, that doesn't mean non-compliance is as well. Resistance doesn't always have to be violence. In fact, in many situations, and what I'm talking about here today is a peaceful non-compliance and resistance, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Here's John Tucker. Let's see if I can pull this up. I still have that episode up on the screen. John Tucker in an election day sermon in Boston in 1771. They don't have sermons like these anymore. But he's talking about what the people have the duty to do. And then of course, this is a sermon, so this is a very morally based statement here. But he says, even under great and manifest oppression, a prudent regard to their own and the public safety may forbid, indeed, violent means of resistance. You don't just have to immediately go from where you are today to a big standoff. And in fact, a lot of times that's not really good strategy. It's not prudent. He says, but it should never lead them tamely to yield to unlawful claims. There's something in the midst. First step is to refuse to cooperate before you take any more aggressive stance. And you have to do that in large numbers and continue pushing forward. James Madison used the same type of a message in Federalist 46 when he was arguing for ratification of the Constitution to a New York audience, primarily at the time. And he was telling people, well, what are we going to do if the federal government goes beyond the limits of its power? And he wrote again in Federalist 48 that you can't rely on the document itself. A parchment barrier isn't enough to keep those departments of the general government in check and keep them from consolidating and then violating your liberty. Needs something else. And that something else includes the disquietude of the people, he said, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's Federalist 46. That's how you keep the federal government in check. Now, mind you, he says a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. We may also think, well, repugnance, you're just grossed out. And I am grossed out by those people all the time. But repugnance in that context doesn't mean disgusted. In fact, the #1 dictionary of the time for the general public, the more lay dictionaries, described repugnant as disobedient, not obsequious. And obsequience is non-compliant. So he says the disquietude of the people, their non-compliance and refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. So you don't follow the act. And then on top of it, when the officers of the Union ask you for help and you ask your state to help enforce, you use legislative devices, he continued, to actually effectuate that. So if you want to stop the federal government, you have to disobey them. Let's circle back to John Dickinson. And he's talking about the same type of thing here at the end of this pamphlet. And this is only excerpts that I found of this pamphlet. I actually haven't found the entire document. There's a Dickinson Papers project that's being published, and I really should actually get the book of that at some point. Side note, anyways, Dickinson sums up at least what I have here. For these reasons, and many more, and this is again his broadside against the Stamp Act 1765, it appears to me the wisest and safest course, the wisest and safest thing for you to do to proceed, he said, I should read that again. For these reasons and many more, it appears to me that the wisest and the safest course for you to proceed in all business as usual without taking the least notice of the Stamp Act. He didn't say go shoot them up or have a big standoff. He said just continue doing what you're doing. They don't have the enforcement mechanism, so just do what you're going to do. Don't comply. And then that sends a message that they're going to have, if they really want this, they're going to have to up their game. And they're really just not going to be able to do that. So he says your conduct will convince Great Britain that the Stamp Act will never be carried into execution, but by force of arms. And this one moment's reflection must demonstrate that she will never attempt. And in fact, that's exactly how it played out. It wasn't just pure noncompliance. There was certainly some very aggressive protests, but there were courts that actually declared it null and void. For example, in Maryland, we know there were some local law enforcement agents that refused to inspect, to enforce things, customs agents that just let the non-stamped papers through. So there was this whole kind of combination of a state, local, and individual level that we always argue for today for good strategy that happened at that time. But a big part of it was Dickinson's urging a refusal to cooperate. And that was so important from John Dickinson. And I want to wrap it up with this one. In October of 1765, and this was probably just a couple of weeks before the Stamp Act was going to go into effect, John Hancock sent a letter to his London agent, I think it was Jonathan Bernard, which really captured this spirit of resistance of the time. He said, "The people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act." Again, different person, not in Pennsylvania, here in Massachusetts, a different viewpoint with the same message that he said, if you submit, you are becoming slaves. And this is exactly what John Dickinson was saying early on in that broadside, what I cited right at the beginning as well. Again, the people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. And it's that spirit of liberty, of a free people willing to take a stand, to take a risk. Liberty isn't just going to be handed to you by people with power. Never. It's going to take some risk. You know, we need much more of this mentality today. And there's absolutely nothing out there that helps us bring this message to more and more people than the financial faith and support of our members. And with that in mind, I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. There's William in West Virginia, Colleen in Kansas, Shaz, I'm just shortening that, in Utah, Jim in Missouri, Lynn in Texas, Richard in Colorado, David in Missouri, Patrick in Florida, Jeffrey in West Virginia, and another Patrick in Michigan. I can't thank you guys enough for putting your financial faith behind our work. You can join them as well over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. We have some annual, 5-year, and lifetime membership options as well. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it was motivational. And of course, if you support the show, you don't have to buy a membership to support us, but that really does help out a great deal. Don't feel any obligation to do that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, but also there's a few other ways you can help us. Easy peasy, free, simple stuff that you can do to help us spread the word. Most of the mainstream platforms are very easily triggered in their algorithm, that is. So doing things like leaving a review on Apple Podcast, or smashing a like button on Facebook or YouTube, or retweeting the Twitter post, whatever it may be, all those things in comments and the archives, all that stuff, that does help trigger that algorithm and tell them to show it to more people. So thank you very much for helping us spread the word. Of course, you can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com if you have some suggestions or questions you want to send my way, and I will look through the comments a little bit later today, depending on maybe on my schedule, likely tomorrow or going a little bit forward, and get back to those as soon as I can. And don't forget, it's most likely that I won't do a show on Wednesday, but then I'll do it on Thursday and Saturday, or Thursday and Friday. We'll see how things all play out. It's just shooting from the hip today. Anyways, I appreciate you being here. I hope you had a wonderful New Year's weekend. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.